In the United States, we spend an obscene amount of money on healthcare. In fact, we actually spend the most money per person on healthcare in the entire world. Now, some might say that the increase in healthcare costs is because our treatments are getting better and more accessible. Some might say that our population is getting sicker and older, and some might even say we're getting more proactive about treating diseases. And these are all true to an extent. But there really is one not so obvious reason why healthcare costs are rising as fast as they are, and that is the rise of big med device. What is up, everybody? My name is Matt Wong, and today we are going to be talking about how big med device successfully facilitated the largest increase in healthcare costs in the history of the United States. So, before we can understand how big medical is driving up the cost of healthcare and raking in ridiculous profits while doing so, we first have to understand the history behind how we got here in the first place. In the 1960s, we were experiencing a boom in computers and electronics. And naturally, this boom transferred over to the biotechnology space. We were seeing hundreds of new medical device products coming onto the market with tons of innovation. We were seeing cardiopulmonary bypass machines. We were seeing pacemakers. We were seeing bone marrow transplants. You name it. There was a boom in the medical device industry. As with any new technology, these devices were prohibitively expensive, and only really the richest of the rich could afford to have the procedures that these devices created. At that time, health insurance was not nearly as all-encompassing as it is today. It was really only used for catastrophic events that required multi-week hospital stays and other extended care. It wasn't used for regular medical expenses like how it's used today. Instead, most people just really paid cash for routine checkups and other regular medical expenses. At this time, you have all of these medical devices coming on the market that are prohibitively expensive. And at the same time, health insurance really isn't that much of a thing yet, and so only the rich can afford these procedures. That is until the year 1965. And what happened in 1965? President Lyndon Johnson passed Medicare. When Medicare was passed, it made it so that not only just the rich could afford cutting-edge medical treatment, now the elderly could as well. And for those of you who don't know, Medicare is just a government-funded health insurance plan for elderly folks who are retired, and so they don't have access to a health insurance plan through their employer because they do not have an employer. With Medicare, the elderly became the big spenders of healthcare, and their treatment was paid for by sweet government cash. Let's think about what Medicare does from a supply and demand economic standpoint. Remember that demand is the amount of people willing and able to pay for something, with able being the key word in this scenario. At first, you have brand new technologies bursting onto the market, but there's low demand because of the high price. Only the rich can afford it. With Medicare, now there's a ton more people, namely the elderly population, that can afford these technologies, and so demand skyrockets. When demand skyrockets, price will rise to meet that demand, and so you have this snowball that starts accumulating. Procedures cost more. Medicare is told that they have to cover this very important life-saving procedure, and then the wheel just keeps spinning, and it's fueled by government dollars. And while all of this is happening, all of the medical technologies being developed, Medicare being passed, while that's happening, the American Medical Association, the AMA, is lobbying the politicians who are passing Medicare to make sure that the doctors that AMA represents can get a nice cut of that government cash. The result was that Medicare allowed doctors to be paid on what's called a fee-for-service model. What that means is the doctors are paid a fee which they set. So Medicare goes to the doctors, asks, how much would you normally charge for this treatment? And they'd say, They could say $1 million, and Medicare would say, okay, we'll cover that. With Medicare, unlike other countries in the United States, the payout to doctors is uncapped. There is no set amount of spending that they can, once they reach that amount of spending, there's no more. So doctors can charge whatever they want. We have Medicare asking the people that it's paying how much they would like to be paid. And so then we start to spin another wheel of more tests, more procedures, more pills, more everything, because the doctors who are prescribing these pills, who are prescribing these tests and performing these procedures are getting paid based off the amount of services they provide. So they're incentivized economically to provide more services. And along with all of this, Medicare is footing the bill. And so these doctors are able to charge way more than they would normally be able to charge a patient who, for example, was paying cash. So now because of all this, everything costs more. Medicare is covering the elderly. The rich don't really care about the rising costs because they can afford it anyways. So what is the average Joe going to do? Well, he's going to seek out insurance because he can't afford to pay these prices on his own. And so now we have the rise and proliferation of private health insurance as we know it today. And so that leads us to the model we have today, where 90% of the US population is covered by some form of health insurance, and those who don't have it are just screwed because they're forced to pay out of pocket for the exorbitant prices we are all now subject to. That's how we got to the health insurance model that we have today. And remember back, what is the medical device industry doing at this time? It's booming. There are thousands of devices coming onto the market in the 1960s and the 1970s. And all different specialties. We have orthopedics, diagnostics, cardiac, vascular, ear, nose, and throat. All, you name it. They're all coming onto the market and taking advantage of this computer and electronics boom. Now, why is this a problem? Well, to understand why it's a problem, we have to understand what it takes to actually sell and market a medical device in the United States. To sell a medical device, it first has to go through a ton of testing and development. It has to go through bench tests, animal model tests, possibly a clinical trial in humans, basically anything you can think of that is needed to show that the device does what it's supposed to do and that it does so in a safe and effective way. After they do all of this testing, they compile it, they analyze the data, they package it all up into what's called a submission. And all a submission is it is a company putting together all of this documentation, data, testing, analysis. They package that all up and they submit it to the FDA, and the FDA reviews it to determine whether they can say that the device is safe and effective and provides the intended benefit that the company put forth to the FDA. The FDA might ask for a variety of types of data, just like I mentioned before, bench testing, animal testing, possibly a clinical trial. This type of a submission is known as a PMA, or a pre-market approval. Okay, so back to the 1960s and 1970s, thousands of medical devices are coming onto the market, all seeking approval from the FDA. The FDA is completely overwhelmed with the amount of submissions that they have to review. And so in 1976, they came up with what is infamously known as the 510K submission. The 510K submission is an alternate pathway to approval from the FDA, and importantly, it is an easier pathway to approval. It is built around the idea of a predicate device. What is a predicate device? Well, it is a device that has already been approved and is on the market that is deemed substantially equivalent to the device that you are looking to get approved. What this means is you're basically saying, hey, that device is already approved and this device is really similar to that device. So we already ran all of our bench testing, animal testing, possibly we even ran a clinical trial on that device. We don't think we should have to do all that again just for a device that has a couple of changes. For example, if a company wants to submit like a next gen pacemaker that has better battery life than the previous generation, they would go to the FDA and they would say, hey, you guys already approved that pacemaker. This pacemaker is the exact same thing except with better battery life, and you guys already reviewed all the data and documentation for that old device. So we're not going to provide you all of that. We're just going to provide you some data on what's changing. So maybe they'll provide like electrical compatibility testing for a new battery. I'm not a pacemaker expert. They could do like reliability testing, whatever needs to be tested on the thing that is changing. And so now what that does is that streamlines the process of approval for all of these medical devices that are based on predicate products. And it's important to note that at its inception, the 510K submission was supposed to be the exception and not the rule. Most devices were supposed to still go through the pre-market approval process and have a full evaluation. And then the handful of devices that were just small changes from previous generations were supposed to be using the 510K. That was the intention. Guess what % of medical devices use the 510K submission now? 98% of all medical devices approved on the market are approved using the 510K submission. And companies will avoid the PMA at all costs because it's much more costly, it's way more rigorous, and it takes much longer. 510K approval takes 90 days to review, PMA takes 180 days. Not only that, but the amount of work actually required for a PMA is way more rigorous than for a 510K. Why would you run a years-long clinical trial for a device when you can just make some small changes from a previous gen and call it next generation and do a 510K? One thing to note here is whenever you see clinical trial, most likely that's a PMA submission. So where does the actual problem with the 510K submission come in? Well, it comes in because you can have a device that is seeking approval based off of a predicate device that was based off of another predicate device and based off another one, and the chain just keeps on going back to the point where you can have devices that are being approved, seeking approval based on devices that were approved before this process was even invented over 30 years ago. And so you have this daisy chain of devices that are just piggybacking off of each other, making small changes with each iteration, and potentially you could have down the line a device that looks completely different than the device that it was based off of if you go back enough iterations. Going even further, many of the devices that are getting 510K clearance today were based off of devices, if you go back through the chain, devices that were put on the market before the FDA was even required to evaluate and approve devices. They would just go onto the market. So with this model, the incentive shifted from proving a device was safe and effective to proving a device is just similar enough to a predicate device to be deemed substantially equivalent. And that old device may or may not have been deemed safe and effective, and it may or may not have even been evaluated by the FDA. For an example of how this process can go horribly, horribly wrong, we're going to look at a company called Depuy Synths, which is owned by Johnson & Johnson. In 2010, Depuy recalled a hip replacement device that went on the market and got FDA clearance in 2008. Hip replacement devices have two major components, the ball and the socket, just like a regular hip. Most of the time, one of those components is made of ceramic, and if both are made of ceramic, for example, that hip replacement is called a ceramic on ceramic hip replacement. Well, Depuy launched a new type of hip replacement, which was a metal on metal hip replacement. That meant that the ball and the socket were both made of metal. This metal on metal hip replacement was based off of a predicate hip replacement device and got 510K clearance from the FDA. Where things get shady is that different characteristics of this new hip were compared with several predicate products. So you had one new hip replacement with features from several different products combined in a way that they had never been before. So what they were able to do was cherry pick which characteristics of the new hip they were able to compare to whichever predicate product they wanted, and it worked. They got clearance. And none of those predicate devices had the same combination of features that this new device had. The result was that they started to see a really high failure rate of these hips. A lot of patients had to go back for more surgery after they got this hip implanted. What they also found was that patients were getting nickel and cobalt poisoning, which just so happens to be the two metals that were used in these metal on metal hip replacements. What they found was that the combination of characteristics in this metal hip were such that the metal ball and the metal socket were rubbing against each other and flaking off cobalt and nickel, and it was getting into people's bloodstreams and poisoning them. And not only that, according to legal documents disclosed in the recall, Depuy knew that their hips had a high failure rate and that they sucked, but they went forward with it anyways. And that brings us to our next topic, the role of quality. So every medical device company has something in their mission about their commitment to quality And they have hundreds, even thousands of quality engineers whose job it is to make sure that products are safe and effective and that they're tested correctly. My first job out of college was actually a specific kind of quality engineer called design assurance. Design assurance engineers are supposed to make sure that the design of the product presents as little risk as possible. And when we say risk, we mean risk of bad things or adverse events happening to the patient. These engineers determine what tests the company has to perform for a device, they analyze the data, and they make sure that the device performs as anticipated. That is what they're supposed to do. But I will tell you how it actually works. Medical device product development takes a very long time, and it follows a very specific process. The marketing people listen to their customers, aka physicians, to try to figure out what problems their next product needs to solve. These are called user needs. The marketing folks bring those user needs to the R&D team, and the R&D team figures out how they can meet those user needs. They figure out what they need to change or what features they need to add or what specs they need to change in order to make a next-gen product that physicians will want to use. They do their thing, they come up with a concept, they design it, they write requirements, they make prototypes, and at the end of this process, which could be several years long, they finally come up with the final product. And this has everything exactly how they want it with the right requirements, the right specs, everything is final. This is the point where they start design verification testing or DV testing. And this is where I would come in as a design assurance engineer. What that means is not that important. All you need to know is that it is the final testing that they're going to be submitting to the FDA to show that the device performs as they say it's going to in a safe and effective way. And it can encompass a lot of testing. It can be like bench testing, like force and tension tests, materials tests, like particulates, testing for how much debris is left on a device after you sterilize it. It could be animal testing. It's a lot. And it's everything that is needed to determine that a product is performing as it should. And it is a big deal. It's a big deal because if you fail one of these tests, that means that you now have to go back to the drawing board and make new specs, make some design changes, whatever is needed to make it so that you can pass these tests. So let's say you do fail some DV testing, and I have seen this firsthand. If you're a design assurance engineer and you see a problem or a failure in the data, you have a few options. You can reanalyze the data using different statistical methods, different analysis methods. There are a variety of tools available to you to reanalyze the data in a way that might make it pass. If that doesn't work, then you have a problem because you are going to have to report an actual DV failure, and nobody wants to hear that. You are going to have to try to figure out why that test failed, and this is where things can get shady. I have seen firsthand where a device had upwards of 10 DV failures. Keep in mind, one DV failure is a big deal. And the design assurance engineers and design assurance managers attributed those failures to causes other than the device itself, even though it's clear that the pattern exhibited points straight to the device being at fault. We were seeing the same type of failure happen over and over, but we said things like, oh, this failure is unrelated to the test being performed, and we didn't actually fail the test, we just weren't able to perform the test in the first place because we had a faulty part. And we just retested and didn't include that failure in the data. And surprise, surprise, we saw that same failure, that same faulty part, giving us problems in commercial devices that were being used in patients. We knew this was a problem, but we still submitted and we still got clearance. We even had a project going on in the background to try to fix the issue, which is just more proof that we knew that this was going on. But it wasn't enough of a big deal to delay the launch. And now I want you to think about why this happens by putting yourself in the shoes of a design assurance manager. As a DA manager, you and your engineers are supposed to be the ones that are safeguarding against this exact type of situation. You are supposed to make sure that the device is as good as it can be, as effective as it can be, and as safe as it can be. Essentially, your job is to minimize risk and maximize benefit of the device. And we're talking about clinical risk and clinical benefit. Now think about being in a situation where you do have a DV failure and you're the one who has to determine whether to send everybody back to the drawing board. And keep in mind, at this point, at this late in the game, the company has already sunk a ton of time and money into this product. You are literally in the home stretch, and now you might have to send everybody back to square one. And maybe your project manager has indicated to leadership that this project is going to be done next year. And so now leadership has factored this product into their forecasted revenue for the year, and marketing has done their research, they've done their market analysis, and now investors and shareholders are expecting this product's revenue to be included in next quarter's earning call. All of this off of a product that potentially you just sent back to square one. And maybe the company has a divisional goal of launching this product next year. And so the bonuses of everybody around you, all your friends, all of your coworkers, all their bonuses are going to get cut because you guys didn't meet your divisional goal because you sent everybody back to the drawing board. And so you can see that every incentive is in place for the supposed gatekeepers of safety and quality to really just be there to ensure that the product meets the minimum requirements that are required for FDA clearance. And we know that for a 510(k) submission, those requirements are not very high. So what is the takeaway here now that we know all of this? We know that industry players have engineered a system where they can make immense profits off of more procedures and more devices, regardless of whether you need them and regardless of whether they're really safe. What are you supposed to do knowing that there is a $500 billion industry that wants its products inside of you? Well, the answer is that you have to educate yourself. If you have a medical condition, especially one that requires an implantable device, unfortunately, it is now your part-time job for you to become an expert on that condition and its treatments. You are the expert on your body, and unfortunately, quite frankly, your doctor is exposed to such an overwhelming amount of information on so many different topics. There's literally no way that any one person can keep up with the latest research on all the treatments in their specialty. And you can actually get to a pretty useful level of knowledge just with some basic research online. The National Institute of Health has a ton of free information online, like clinical guidelines and research that are free to view and open access. The website clinicaltrials.gov is a current list of all ongoing and past clinical trials that you can use to look up possibly treatments for your medical condition. And there are tons of associations and societies that publish free literature online on sites like PubMed. The FDA also makes public all 510(k) and PMA approval letters so that you can see how a device was approved. You need to research the types of implantables and treatments available for your medical condition, the different brands, and the clinical evidence backing them up. I know it's not fun and it's tedious and boring at times, but honestly, the way that things are right now, you really have no choice but to be your own advocate. Doctors often say that their least favorite patients are like the ones who just go look up everything on WebMD and then come back and they think they know everything already. But honestly, if you've already been diagnosed with a medical condition, I see absolutely no problem in challenging your doctor on what the best form of treatment is in your situation if you're educated on the subject. If you want to protect yourself from the medical industrial complex that has taken over our healthcare system, then you need to equip yourself with the knowledge that can hopefully protect you from becoming another statistic in a recall letter and hopefully help you get to the best treatment for you. And with that, that is the end of the video. If you learned something, if you liked the video, like, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff. And if you have a story of maybe an experience you had with the healthcare system, drop it in the comments and I'll read it so that I can know what to do for the next video. With that, peace.